You might get caught up in the spectacle of Fallout 3's larger narratives without much effort. But don't overlook the giant ant population that's quietly overtaking the capital wasteland. I'm Mark from Digital Dissection. I make Fallout lore videos. And while I'm not an entomologist, today I'll be your guide to the ants of Fallout 3's world. Sure, ants can be overlooked as a small piece of Fallout's games. And while I don't consider them a faction by any means, they're quietly a looming presence in Fallout 3. You'll come across them sure as randomly occurring enemies in your travels. But there manages to be fascinating developments with these creatures if you decide to take a closer look. While simple in terms of combat prowess, most ant foes won't cause a tremendous amount of stress in a skirmish. However, the most commonly encountered versions of them aren't a true representation of how diverse the enemy type is across the entirety of the game. Their variations go far further than being an occasional inconvenience while exploring DC. Due to my completely bizarre and nonsensical exploration of the Capital Wasteland, I actually ran into them due to skipping some of the game's biggest quests in my first playthrough. One of the first times I actually dealt with them likely wasn't the one most of you are probably thinking, as I actually wound up encountering them in the ruins of the former Corvega factory, which from the outside doesn't really seem like somewhere you'd likely find them. Before Fallout's Great War, the Corvega factory manufactured the popular Corvega brand of vehicles seen across numerous billboards and advertisements in the area. The flagship brand of the Chrysler Corporation has clearly seen better days, and upon first entry, one might notice the various raiders, mercenaries, and wastelanders who didn't leave this location alive. What was previously a business office that would have been bustling with likely salesmen, factory workers, and administrators is now a ruined and infested locale. Its ominous, dusty interior has the telltale noises of the giant ant population. A crunching, chattering noise that's your key indicator of the oversized insect's presence. It's unknown exactly when the ants decided to take over this former site of commercial importance over hundreds of years ago. But within the offices we can see several of their soldiers patrolling this area, protecting clutches of eggs that are housed just before its larger production facility. Regardless of when they moved in, they clearly are established here and not moving on anytime soon. For the majority of the Capital Wasteland, however, this brood represents the standard mutated arthropod insects that were derived from the Formicidae family, a genus of large ants known as the Camponotus. Of the many species that survived Fallout's Great War, there are a few equals in terms of likely origin stories, and these large creatures closely represent what was once known as the carpenter ant. While the carpenter ant, however, would typically create nests in dead, damp wood, this group has decided that a prefabricated home would suit them just fine. Of course, these ants are nowhere close in size to that of their pre-war likely ancestors, and instead of being roughly 7 to 13 millimeters in length, these ones have grown to several feet, larger than most of even the biggest dog breeds. For those of you who noticed earlier that we mentioned the presence of eggs, the ants at the Corvega offices actually represent what's known as a satellite colony of its larger central parent, a concept that's known to ants and their tunneling systems. The largest central parent colony is actually held within the factory section. Within the previous manufacturing section is clearly a much more active and thriving population compared to the offices we first encountered. From top to bottom, the giant ants have tapped into nearly every section of the factory, and much like their very tiny counterparts, have probably scavenged and explored as much as they could have in terms of food sources. But as we've discussed the presence of eggs in a larger population, the reason this is possible at all is because of the largest ant found amongst the brood, that being the giant ant queen. What we haven't talked about so far is that even normal ants can be considered both predators and scavengers, and the brood consisting of various soldiers and workers will already be hostile to players. The level of aggression possible from a queen ant, however, far exceeds what the smaller variants are capable of. Despite being longer than a Corvega vehicle herself, the queen ant has a remarkable field of vision, and can recognize a foreign entity within her nest even over a football field away. While her colony may feature melee attackers as its primary defense, the queen is not limited to the abilities of her mandibles, and can actually fire projectiles. The acidic ranged attack packs a punch, and in this enclosed space, getting hit with it is a noticeable impact on one's health bar. The only drawback she really has is her tremendous lack of mobility, and given her size in relation to a city bus, she won't be setting any land speed records. Many years ago, when I encountered her for the first time, her inclusion in such a small area invoked quite a bit of panic, and it would serve as an important reminder because the boss-level character isn't unique to the Corvega factory. She actually has several equals. One who has actually managed to create an even more dangerous giant ant population across the Potomac River to the southeast, near the former town of Grayditch. Grayditch should be familiar to most players within the world of Fallout 3. It's hard to go anywhere near the now uninhabited settlement without running into Brian Wilkes, a young boy who survived a giant ant infestation that killed nearly all of its people, save for Brian himself and an unnamed Grayditch resident who abandoned him. While giant ants already pose enough of a threat to humanity, this particular colony had a unique ability that others in the Capital Wasteland did not. They developed pyrosis, literally spewing fire from their mouths. The ants, however, did not develop fire breathing naturally. They had a little help from a scientist named Dr. Weston Lesko. Originally, Grayditch seemed to be a safe enough place to live, with 7 people creating homes there, gradually settling the location throughout 2276, which welcomed the Wilkes and Brandis families, and later, Lesko on November 15, 2276. Lesko's arrival would unknowingly cause Grayditch's downfall, as he sought to develop experimental means to address the Capital Wasteland's mutated wildlife, and ways to potentially revert certain species back to their pre-war forms, or at minimum, a safer evolutionary alternative. Around the same time, a large colony of giant ants had already created a home in the former Marigold Station to the south of Grayditch. Lesko, seeking an opportunity to explore his scientific pursuits, began developing a field research facility to get closer to their nest. It was here that he'd put his plan to action, utilizing an experimental form of forced evolutionary virus to reverse their growth, a mutagen that potentially would shrink the Marigold colony into a much more manageable size over time. Lesko thought that if he could only inject the FEV into their egg clutches, that the mutagen would succeed. The results, however, could not have been farther from the expectations Lesko desired, as the ants not only became bigger, but also more aggressive, and they'd become further expansive in their pursuits, eventually overrunning the Grayditch community. The scientist's aloof attitude, however, wasn't concerned at all with the destruction and death he caused, instead only continuing to tinker with the initial mutagen that created these literal fire ants. Why he wasn't able to finish his work, however, was due to the fact that the fire ants had pushed him from his workstation closest to the Queen Ant's chambers, which were fiercely protected by 5 guardians, a unique soldier type which we didn't see in the Corvega factory. These guardian ants are larger than the rest of the brood, are far more durable, and provide an extra level of danger given the close quarters of this area. The chamber itself also differs greatly compared to the Corvega ant colony, as these ants chose a much more closed-in living space for its queen, while the larger population dispersed across the entirety of the former subway system, its area above ground, and the surrounding communities. The 2 ant populations we've seen so far, however, despite the clear differences in experimentation between them, show critically unique living arrangements. It's hard to necessarily posit how the Marigold colony would have behaved without Lesko's intervention, but one thing we can glean from the group is that they already began to encroach on the Grayditch community before being exposed to FEV. Former Grayditch resident William Brandis confirmed this in his November 15, 2276 terminal entry, which included comments about dealing with them long before Lesko's manipulation of the ants' eggs. This showed that the ant colony may have already been uniquely aggressive before ever being tampered with, but clearly their transformation only further enhanced this behavior. Their territorial pursuits only continued to worsen into February of 2277, causing Grayditch's residents to invest in heavier weaponry to deal with them. But Brandis also goes on to detail a unique difference between the Marigold colony and normal wasteland ants in a terminal entry dated April 2nd, 2277.
I'm going to have to find a better way to protect Sheila and Will from those ants. Ever since Lesko came to town, I'm certain they're getting more and more aggressive. Wasteland ants are bad enough, but at least you could run away from them. These would seem to pursue you to the ends of the earth if they could. Call me crazy, but I swear I saw one start a fire the other day. I don't know how this could be happening.
Aggression, however, isn't unique to the marigold giant ants, as another scenario involving them developed on the outskirts of the wasteland in the community of Shalebridge. Far outside the DC metro and its outskirts lies a location named Shalebridge, directly southwest of the abandoned car fort. The area, however, has no real human settlers attempting to create homes at this site, due to the fact that two rival colonies of ants live here and are locked in a fight to the death. The landscape of Shalebridge is incredibly hilly by design, and underneath this terrain are separate tunnel systems, which include the Shalebridge tunnels and the Shalebridge Hill locations. An important detail to focus on, however, is the fungus that grows here, as the Shalebridge tunnels sport a specific green fungus, which align with a passive group of giant ants called the foragers. The foragers are one of the few ant colonies that aren't immediately hostile to human intervention, and won't harm the player character when exploring their home. Compared to other giant ants of the Capital Wasteland, they are far smaller than all other species you'll encounter, being more on par with the size of most radroaches. This group, however, is under constant attack by their rivals known as the invaders, who are much larger in comparison and have a golden fungus that surrounds their colony. Entering the Shalebridge tunnels will give you a front seat to the feud between these uniquely different colonies of ants, who are locked in a tough battle for survival once you arrive. The invader ants will immediately attack the player, adding incentive to take out the aggressors while investigating the site further. If attacked, however, by the player, the foragers will defend themselves, but not all at once, and only if they are nearby to these aggressive actions. A quick look around will show that the invaders, of course, do not live primarily in the Shalebridge tunnels, and hail from the colony nearby at Shalebridge Hill. What's odd about this arrangement is that the forager branch does not have the influence of a queen in its home, while one can be discovered in the neighboring location. What we don't quite know is why this would lead to the two colonies fighting each other, but oddly enough, real-life nature can actually provide enough of an explanation. The Journal of Science, Volume 24, Issue 3 of May 2024 actually featured the work of two researchers named Jackson Champer and his mother, Deborah Schlenoff, who both hold PhDs and are affiliated with Peking University and the University of Oregon, respectively. The researchers reviewed over 50 years' worth of ant documentation, specific to observed combat and battles between colonies, where they discovered an interesting parallel found between two specific types, the Siphomirmix longiscapus and the Megalomyrmex species. The C. longiscapus ants specifically grow fungus within their colonies, and over decades of observation, were found to be particularly susceptible to attacks from outside ant populations. Their behavior during battles would focus predominantly on gathering as much of their larval brood and fungus as possible, choosing a flight response rather than fight their aggressors in hope to rebuild elsewhere. Does this sound familiar? Well, it gets even more specific. Megalomyrmex ants during warfare, in contrast, will counter the flight response of C. longiscapus by picking up their rivals and carrying them away from their nest, preventing their less aggressive neighbors from escaping and cutting off their chances to form a new colony. What was further noticed amongst the extensive study, as well as numerous resources, is that ants are constantly in a battle for territory and materials, and have consistently developed unique tactics to fight each other. Some of these are evolutionary, developing tolerances to venoms one might use against the other, to literally developing thicker shells or carapaces to thwart attacks. Regardless, ants have been fighting for far longer than humans have even been on the face of the earth, and the Shalebridge ants in comparison are doing what has been observed for generations. The difference here, however, is that players much like Lesko and Marigold Station have a choice to make, and can inject a stim pack in the forager group's eggs to increase their hardiness, to ensure that their colony continues into the future. While ants in nature may not have the same help, the foragers at least have a fighting chance should you choose to help them. There may be a clue, however, as to why the foragers are in such a unique predicament, as even their title indicates that they are mutated in capacity. So whether this is a function of the exposure to the unique green fungus they live near, or some additional outside influence, there's an unknown factor at play that caused their size difference compared to all other witnessed ant populations across Fallout 3. How they'll survive without a queen, however, is anyone's guess. But it's crazy how accurate this fiction is in relation to real-world events documented by researchers. Of the many memorable moments in Fallout 3, the Superhuman Gambit quest features a somewhat humorous and equally odd ongoing battle between two individuals with assumed personas, one being the Mechanist and the other the Antagonizer. The settlement of Canterbury Commons has dealt with the two superheroes battling each other dozens of times, as the Mechanist uses robotic forces to battle the Antagonizer's giant ant soldiers. We'll of course be focusing on the latter, as well. We've already been talking about ants this long already. The Antagonizer is actually a woman known as Tanya Kristoff, who grew up as the daughter of caravan drivers. But decades previous to the year 2277, her parents were killed after being attacked by giant ants, leaving Tanya an orphan who would slowly descend into an increasingly concerning mental state. Traders who discovered the ant attack found the bodies of Tanya's parents, but not Tanya herself. And for years many assumed she had perished during these events. Tanya, however, actually continued on in an attempt to seek meaning to surviving this ordeal. She would eventually discover Hubris Comics, which featured a supervillain named the Antagonizer within its Grognak the Barbarian series. She found the Antagonizer's story compelling, as the character was also an orphan who hated mankind and would learn to befriend and live their life amongst a colony of ants. Kristoff would actually follow the same path, creating a lair within the sewer systems near to Canterbury Commons, a town she now hated as she felt it represented the worst of humanity, even though this was a settlement her own parents helped build. What eventually happened, as observed by the residents of Canterbury Commons, was that over time they began to notice that giant ants would begin congregating in this same sewer system, as it would seem that Tanya took the Grognak comics and made them reality, as she somehow learned to tame the ants, enlisting them as soldiers in her own insect army. The ants willingly follow Tanya around, as she can be witnessed bringing several of them into Canterbury Commons in a direct conflict with the Mechanist, and they also inhabit her lair nearby. How she managed to achieve this is not entirely known, but the ants are clearly loyal to her and obey her instructions, whether it be to attack specific targets or follow her commands. Tanya's ability to use them at will is impressive, but given that others have been witnessed taming animals within Fallout 3, it's not entirely an outlier. Tanya's ability, however, to essentially replace a queen ant as the leader of a colony is a concept worth studying further, as an ant population cannot survive long-term without one. So unfortunately, reality will one day set in for even her well-trained ant soldiers, as they'll either die of old age or the likely hazards they'll come across in the wasteland. It remains impressive, though, that one human being could manage to control an entire group of giant ants in such a fashion as this. Whether she achieved it through pheromones or other means, we may not ever know. While this may not be the first topic many of you think of when exploring Fallout, I actually was always intrigued by what the ants of Fallout 3 were doing. While it's a fictional world full of fictional things, the depictions of ants throughout the game in particular were pretty fascinating when you examine the unique colonies spread across the capital wasteland. But in comparison to other enemy types, ants actually got some intriguing storylines woven into their existence. And while many might just run away from them or dispatch them quite easily, they're worth taking a closer look at in terms of how they live, and the internal squabbles even amongst their species. Considering that the queen ants are also mini-bosses, it's worth at least taking them down to get their pheromones, an item that several in the wasteland consider to be, well, an aphrodisiac. So, have fun questing, if that's your kind of thing. And with that, we thank you for joining us as we explore the curious ants of Fallout 3. Were there any giant ant facts that we missed? Let us know in the comments. We also accept your suggestions for future videos, and your next idea could get a shout-out. For more weekly content just like this video, check out our Exploring the Wasteland playlist here, and a recommended video from our channel. As always, Wastelanders, keep on dissecting. Thank you for watching. This is Mark signing off.